The golden ankh hung suspended in the air, its ethereal glow casting long shadows across the temple floor. Pharaoh Menkhotep reached out with trembling fingers, his eyes wide with both wonder and fear. As his skin made contact with the ancient symbol, a searing pain shot through his body, and he saw it all, the future of his beloved Egypt laid bare before him in a terrifying tapestry of triumph and tragedy. But could he bear the weight of this divine gift, or would it crush him beneath its unyielding demands? The oppressive heat of the Egyptian summer bore down on the magnificent city of Thebes, its golden spires and towering obelisks shimmering in the relentless sun. Within the cool confines of the royal palace, Pharaoh Menkhotep paced restlessly, his ornate robes rustling with each agitated step. The weight of the golden ankh around his neck seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment, a constant reminder of the burdensome gift bestowed upon him by the gods. It had been 3 years since that fateful night in the temple of Amun-Ra when the deity himself had appeared to Menkhotep in a vision. The god had offered him unparalleled wisdom, the ability to foresee every calamity that would befall his kingdom. But like all divine gifts, it came with a price. Each disaster could only be averted through a specific sacrifice from his people, a test of their faith and devotion to both their pharaoh and the gods themselves. At first, Menkhotep had embraced this power with enthusiasm, believing it to be the key to ushering in a golden age for Egypt. He had successfully guided his kingdom through a devastating plague by sacrificing the season's first harvest to Sekhmet, the goddess of healing. When a massive earthquake threatened to level the great city of Memphis, he had ordered the destruction of the newly built temple of Ptah, appeasing the earth god Geb and sparing countless lives. But with each averted catastrophe, the sacrifices demanded by the gods grew more severe, more personal. Menkhotep found himself questioning the true nature of his gift. Was it truly wisdom, or a cruel test of his resolve? Now, as he gazed out over the sprawling city that was the jewel of his empire, a sense of foreboding settled over him like a shroud. Something was coming, something far worse than anything he had faced before. As if summoned by his thoughts, a searing pain lanced through Menkhotep's head. He stumbled, catching himself against a nearby column as visions flooded his mind. He saw fields withering under a merciless sun, the life-giving waters of the Nile reduced to a trickle. His people lay dying in the streets, their emaciated bodies a testament to the famine that gripped the land. When the vision cleared, Menkhotep found himself on his knees, gasping for breath. The full horror of what he had seen settled over him like a leaden weight. A great famine was coming, one that threatened to destroy everything he had worked so hard to build. With shaking hands, he grasped the ankh around his neck, closing his eyes as he beseeched the gods for guidance. Great Amun-Ra, Lord of all creation, what must be done to save our people from this terrible fate? The response came not in words, but in another vision, one that chilled Menkhotep to his very core. He saw his beloved daughter, Princess Nailah, lying motionless upon the altar in the temple of Amun-Ra. A sacrificial dagger glinted in the torchlight, poised to strike. "No!" Menkhotep cried out, his voice echoing through the empty chamber. He staggered to his feet, his mind reeling from the implications of what he had seen. The gods demanded the ultimate sacrifice, the life of his only child, his heir, the light of his life. For the first time since receiving his gift, Menkhotep found himself paralyzed with indecision. How could he even contemplate such an act? And yet, how could he condemn his entire kingdom to slow starvation and death? As he struggled with this impossible choice, a soft voice broke through his tortured thoughts. "Father, are you all right?" Menkhotep turned to see Nailah standing in the doorway, concern etched across her beautiful features. At 16, she was the spitting image of her mother, who had passed away years before. Her kind heart and quick wit had made her beloved by all who knew her, and Menkhotep felt his chest constrict at the thought of losing her. "I'm fine, my dear," he lied, forcing a smile. "Just lost in thought." Nailah wasn't fooled. She crossed the room and took her father's hands in her own. "You've seen something, haven't you? Another disaster?" Menkhotep hesitated, then nodded slowly. "A famine," he admitted, unable to meet her eyes. unlike anything Egypt has ever faced. Then we must act quickly, Nailah said, her voice filled with determination. What sacrifice do the gods require this time? The pharaoh felt his throat constrict, the words refusing to come. How could he tell her the truth? How could he not? Before he could formulate a response, a commotion erupted in the hallway outside. Moments later, Imhotep, Menkhotep's most trusted advisor, burst into the room, his face ashen. "My pharaoh," he gasped, dropping to one knee. "Forgive the interruption, but we've just received word from the southern provinces. The crops are failing, and the Nile, it's starting to recede far earlier than usual." Menkhotep closed his eyes, his worst fears confirmed. The famine was already beginning, and he was running out of time to make his terrible choice. "Leave us," he commanded, his voice hoarse. As Imhotep hurried from the room, Menkhotep turned to his daughter. "Nailah, I need you to gather the royal court. We must convene immediately to discuss this threat." The princess nodded, her eyes shining with a mix of fear and determination. As she turned to leave, Menkhotep called out to her, "And Nailah, I love you. Never forget that." She smiled, a ray of sunshine in the growing darkness. "I love you too, father. We'll face this together, as we always have." As the door closed behind her, Menkhotep sank onto his throne, the weight of his decision threatening to crush him. Could he really sacrifice his own daughter to save his kingdom? And if he refused, could he live with the knowledge that he had condemned countless innocents to a slow, agonizing death? The next few days passed in a blur of frantic activity. Messengers were dispatched to every corner of the kingdom, assessing the extent of the impending disaster. Reports flooded in, each more dire than the last. Crops withered in the fields, livestock perished for lack of water and feed, and the mighty Nile continued its unprecedented retreat. Menkhotep threw himself into the crisis, working tirelessly to implement every measure he could think of to mitigate the coming catastrophe. Grain stores were rationed, trade missions were sent to neighboring kingdoms to secure additional food supplies, and prayers and offerings to the gods increased tenfold. But deep down, he knew it wasn't enough. The vision of the famine had been clear. Nothing short of divine intervention would be sufficient to save Egypt from this calamity. And the price for that intervention was one he could scarcely bear to contemplate. As the situation grew more desperate, Menkhotep found himself withdrawing from those around him, including Nailah. He couldn't bear to look at her, knowing the terrible fate that awaited her if he chose to follow the gods' demands. His daughter, ever perceptive, noticed his distress and redoubled her efforts to help, taking on more responsibilities and working tirelessly to support her father and her people. Her selflessness only made Menkhotep's dilemma more agonizing. How could he even consider sacrificing someone so good, so full of promise? One evening, as the sun set over Thebes in a blaze of crimson and gold, Menkhotep stood alone on his private balcony, gazing out over the city he had sworn to protect. The streets below were already showing signs of the coming hardship. Fewer vendors in the markets, thinner crowds in the squares, a palpable tension in the air. "You seem troubled, old friend." Menkhotep turned to find Imhotep standing in the doorway, concern etched across his weathered features. The advisor had been by Menkhotep's side for decades, one of the few people who knew the full extent of the pharaoh's gift, and its terrible price. "How can I not be?" Menkhotep replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "You've seen the reports. Nothing we've done has made a difference. The famine is coming, and it will destroy everything we've built." Imhotep stepped forward, joining the pharaoh at the balcony's edge. "Then perhaps it's time to consider other options." Menkhotep's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing. "What are you suggesting?" The advisor hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Your gift has never failed us before, my pharaoh. If the gods have shown you a way to avert this disaster, then surely—" "No." Menkhotep's fist came down hard on the balustrade, the pain barely registering through his anger and grief. "You cannot ask this of me, Imhotep. Not this." Understanding dawned in the older man's eyes. "The princess," he breathed. "The gods demand." Nailah. Menkhotep nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. Imhotep was silent for a long moment, the weight of this revelation settling over him. When he finally spoke, his voice was gentle but firm. My pharaoh, I cannot begin to imagine the pain this choice must cause you. But you must consider the consequences of inaction. Thousands, perhaps millions, will die if this famine is not averted. Is one life, even one so precious, worth more than all of those? She's my daughter, Menkhotep whispered, his voice breaking. My only child. How can I? You are not just a father, Imhotep reminded him. You are the pharaoh, chosen by the gods to lead and protect all of Egypt. Sometimes, the greatest acts of leadership require the greatest sacrifices. Before Menkhotep could respond, a commotion erupted in the courtyard below. Both men leaned over the balcony to see a group of farmers being held back by palace guards. Their cries carried up to where the pharaoh stood. Please, great pharaoh. We beg for your help. Our children are starving. The Nile has abandoned us. Menkhotep closed his eyes, each desperate plea another twist of the knife in his heart. When he opened them again, there was a new resolve in his gaze. Prepare the royal barge, he commanded Imhotep. We leave for the temple of Amun-Ra at dawn. As the first light of dawn painted the sky in shades of rose and gold, the royal barge glided silently down the Nile. Menkhotep stood at the prow, his face a mask of stone as he gazed at the receding shoreline. Behind him, Nailah sat in quiet contemplation, unaware of the true purpose of their journey. The pharaoh had told her only that they were going to the great temple to seek the gods' guidance in averting the famine. It wasn't a lie, not exactly, but the omission of the terrible truth weighed heavily on Menkhotep's conscience. As they approached the massive temple complex, Menkhotep felt a subtle shift in the air. The breeze carried the scent of incense and the faint echoes of chanting priests. It was as if the very fabric of reality was growing thin, the barrier between the mortal world and the realm of the gods becoming more permeable with each passing moment. They docked at the temple's private quay, and Menkhotep led the small procession up the long avenue of sphinxes. Nailah walked at his side, her head held high, every inch the princess she had been raised to be. Menkhotep's heart swelled with pride and ached with sorrow in equal measure. At the temple's entrance, they were met by the high priest of Amun-Ra, his shaved head gleaming in the morning sun. He bowed low before the pharaoh and his daughter. Welcome, divine one, the priest intoned. We have prepared the inner sanctum as you requested. All is in readiness. Menkhotep nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He turned to Nailah, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Wait here, my dear. There are matters I must discuss with the high priest alone. Nailah frowned, sensing the tension in her father's voice. Father, what's wrong? Why can't I come with you? Please, Nailah, Menkhotep pleaded. Trust me in this. I promise I will explain everything soon. After a moment's hesitation, the princess nodded. As you wish, father. I'll wait in the outer courtyard. As she walked away, Menkhotep felt as if a part of his soul was being torn from his body. He wanted nothing more than to call her back, to flee this place and damn the consequences. But the weight of his crown, of his duty to his people, held him in place. The high priest led Menkhotep deep into the temple's shadowy interior, past towering columns and walls covered in intricate hieroglyphs. They came at last to a small, circular chamber lit only by flickering torches. In the center stood a stone altar, its surface stained dark with the blood of countless sacrifices. Is this where? Menkhotep couldn't finish the question. The high priest nodded solemnly. Yes, my pharaoh. This is where the will of the gods shall be done. Menkhotep approached the altar, his legs feeling leaden with each step. He placed his hands on the cool stone, closing his eyes as he reached out with his divine gift, seeking confirmation, guidance, or perhaps a miracle. The vision came swiftly and with brutal clarity. He saw two possible futures laid out before him. In one, Nailah lay still upon this very altar, her lifeblood seeping into the stone. But beyond that terrible image, he saw fields bursting with grain, the Nile swelling with life-giving water, his people prospering for generations to come. In the other future, he saw only devastation. The famine swept across Egypt like a plague, leaving nothing but dust and bones in its wake. Thebes, the greatest city in the world, reduced to a ghost town. And at the center of it all, Nailah, older, haggard, dying alone in a world destroyed by his inability to make the ultimate sacrifice. Menkhotep's eyes snapped open, his decision made. With a heavy heart, he turned to the high priest. "Bring her," he commanded, his voice hoarse with unshed tears. As the priest hurried to obey, Menkhotep sank to his knees before the altar. "Forgive me," he whispered, though whether he was addressing the gods or his daughter, he couldn't say. Minutes passed like hours as Menkhotep waited, every heartbeat an agony of anticipation and dread. When he finally heard footsteps approaching, he rose to his feet, steeling himself for what was to come. But it wasn't Nailah who entered the chamber. Instead, Imhotep stumbled in, his face pale and his eyes wide with fear. "My Pharaoh," he gasped. "The princess. She's gone." Menkhotep felt the world tilt beneath his feet. "What? How?" "She must have overheard us on the barge," Imhotep explained. "When I went to fetch her, I found only this." He held out a small papyrus scroll, sealed with Nailah's personal mark. With trembling hands, Menkhotep broke the seal and unrolled the scroll. As he read the message within, he felt his heart both break and swell with pride. "Dearest father, I know what the gods have asked of you, and I know the terrible choice you face. But I will not allow you to bear this burden alone. You have taught me that a true ruler must always put the needs of their people first. It is time for me to live up to that teaching. At the time you read this, I will be gone. I go now to face my destiny, to make the sacrifice that our kingdom needs. Please do not mourn for me, for I go willingly and with love in my heart. Love for you, for Egypt, and for all our people. Be the great Pharaoh I know you to be. Lead our people through this crisis and into a brighter future. And remember always that I love you. Your devoted daughter, Nailah." The papyrus slipped from Menkhotep's numb fingers, fluttering to the ground like a fallen leaf. For a moment, he stood frozen, unable to process the magnitude of what had just happened. Then, with a roar of anguish that shook the very foundations of the temple, he sprang into action. "Find her," he bellowed, his voice echoing through the stone corridors. "Search every corner of the temple, every street in the city. She cannot have gone far." As priests and guards scrambled to obey, Menkhotep turned to Imhotep, his eyes wild with desperation. Where would she go? Think, old friend. Where would she make such a sacrifice? Imhotep's brow furrowed in concentration. "The princess has always been drawn to the Nile," he mused. "She believes it to be the lifeblood of Egypt. Perhaps." The source of the Nile, Menkhotep breathed, realization dawning. The ancient texts speak of a hidden shrine at the river's source, where the gods themselves are said to drink. If she sought to make the ultimate sacrifice to end the famine. Without another word, Menkhotep sprinted from the chamber, Imhotep struggling to keep up. They burst out of the temple into the blinding sunlight, where the royal barge still waited at the quay. "Make ready to sail," Menkhotep shouted to the startled crew. "We make for the source of the Nile, and may Ammonius Ra himself grant us speed." As the barge pulled away from the shore, Menkhotep gripped the railing so tightly his knuckles turned white. His mind raced, calculating distances and times. The source of the Nile was many days' journey upriver, through dangerous rapids and uncharted territories. But Nailah had a head start, and she knew the stakes as well as he did. The next days passed in a blur of frantic activity. Menkhotep drove the crew mercilessly, stopping only when absolutely necessary to rest or resupply. He barely ate or slept, his eyes constantly scanning the shoreline for any sign of his daughter. As they pressed further south, the landscape changed. Lush riverbanks gave way to rocky cliffs, and the once mighty Nile narrowed to a fraction of its former width. The air grew cooler, hinting at the distant mountains where the great river was born. On the 5th day of their journey, as the first light of dawn painted the sky, Imhotep approached Menkhotep with grave news. "My pharaoh," he said softly, "the men have spotted something ahead. A small boat, beached on the western shore." Menkhotep's heart leaped into his throat. "Nailah's?" Imhotep nodded solemnly. "It appears so. And there are tracks leading into the jungle." Without hesitation, Menkhotep ordered the barge to make for shore. As soon as they were close enough, he leaped into the shallow water, wading through the swift current with single-minded determination. Imhotep and a handful of guards followed close behind. The jungle was thick and unyielding, but Menkhotep pressed on, following the faint trail left by his daughter. Thorns tore at his royal robes, and branches whipped his face, but he barely noticed. His entire being was focused on one goal: finding Nailah before it was too late. After what felt like hours of struggle, the dense foliage suddenly gave way to a small clearing. In its center stood an ancient stone structure, weathered by countless years but still unmistakably of divine origin. Intricate carvings covered its surface, depicting the gods and the creation of the Nile itself. And there, at the foot of the shrine, lay Nailah. "No!" Menkhotep cried, rushing forward. He gathered his daughter in his arms, his heart pounding with fear. But as he looked closer, he realized she was still breathing, though her skin was pale and cold to the touch. Nailah's eyes fluttered open, focusing slowly on her father's face. A weak smile touched her lips. "Father," she whispered. "You came." "Of course I came," Menkhotep said, tears streaming down his face. "How could I not? Oh, my brave, foolish child. What have you done?" "What needed to be done," Nailah replied, her voice growing stronger. "I offered myself to the gods, father. My life for the life of Egypt." As if in response to her words, the ground beneath them began to tremble. A low rumble filled the air, growing louder with each passing moment. Menkhotep looked up in awe as a trickle of water began to flow from the base of the shrine, quickly swelling into a rushing stream. "The source," Imhotep gasped, falling to his knees in reverence. "It's awakening." Menkhotep could scarcely believe his eyes as he watched the miracle unfold before him. The stream became a river, its waters clear and pure, teeming with life. He could feel the power emanating from it, the promise of renewal and abundance for all of Egypt. But even as joy and relief flooded through him, Menkhotep's heart clenched with fear. He looked down at Nailah, still cradled in his arms. "The sacrifice," he whispered. "If the gods have accepted it, then you—" Nailah shook her head, her eyes shining with an inner light. "No, father. The gods did not take my life. They took my mortality." As Menkhotep watched in wonder, a soft glow began to emanate from Nailah's skin. She sat up, strength returning to her limbs, and gestured towards the flowing waters. "I understand now," she said, her voice resonating with newfound power. "The gods did not desire death, but transformation. In offering myself wholly to Egypt, I have become one with the Nile itself. I am to be its guardian, ensuring that our people will never again face such a terrible famine." Menkhotep struggled to comprehend the magnitude of what had transpired. His daughter, his precious Nailah, was no longer merely a princess. She had become something more, something divine. "But I don't understand," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "Why did the gods show me those visions? Why demand such a terrible choice?" Nailah smiled gently, reaching out to touch her father's cheek. "Perhaps, father, the test was not for Egypt, but for us. To see if we would be willing to sacrifice everything for the greater good. In facing that choice with courage and love, we have proven ourselves worthy of the gods' blessings." As the truth of her words sank in, Menkhotep felt a great weight lift from his shoulders. The burden of his gift, which had for so long felt like a curse, now seemed a blessing beyond measure. For it had led them here, to this moment of transformation and renewal. With tears of joy in his eyes, Menkhotep embraced his daughter one last time. "My dear Nailah," he whispered, "you have saved us all." Nailah's laughter rang out, clear and melodious as the rushing waters beside them. "No, father. We saved ourselves, together. Now go, return to our people. Tell them that the famine has ended, and that the Nile will forever flow with abundance. As Menkhotep reluctantly prepared to leave, Nailah stepped into the sacred waters. Her form shimmered and blurred, becoming one with the river itself. But her voice echoed in the air, a promise and a benediction. I will always be with you, Father, in every drop of the Nile, in every grain that grows on its banks. Lead our people well, and know that I watch over you all. Menkhotep stood for a long moment, watching the spot where his daughter had vanished. Then, squaring his shoulders, he turned to face Imhotep and the awestruck guards. Come, he said, his voice ringing with renewed purpose. We have a kingdom to rebuild, and a miracle to share. As they made their way back through the jungle, Menkhotep felt a profound sense of peace settle over him. The future he had once feared now held the promise of unprecedented prosperity for Egypt. And though the path ahead would not be without its challenges, he knew he would face them with wisdom, courage, and the enduring love of a daughter who had become legend. For in the end, the true measure of a pharaoh, of any leader, was not in the sacrifices they were willing to make, but in the hope they could inspire in others. And in that, Menkhotep knew, he and Nailah had succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. As the royal barge set sail for home, Menkhotep stood at the prow, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The Nile flowed strong and true beneath them, carrying whispers of renewal to every corner of the kingdom. And in its gentle current, Menkhotep could almost hear Nailah's voice, guiding him always towards a brighter future for Egypt and its people.